Thanks for joining us for Religious Hard Talk. I'm Ian Boyne. Seventh-day Adventist apologist Derrick Gillespie is back in his rebuttal of Dr. Andre Hill, who came on the last season of Religious Hard Talk to put forward a searing critique of Seventh-day Adventism and its founder, Ellen G. White. Last week, Derrick Gillespie took on the charges frontally, dealt with them. You are the jury. You have your own opinions, but certainly everyone knows, everyone who saw Gillespie last week knows, this guy is no slouch, he's no novice at this matter of debating, even pulled in things to discredit the host religious leader. I give a lot of ratings to Gillespie. He's back to deal with other charges. Andre Hill had made the charge that Mrs. White actually talked about amalgamation of man and beast, that man and beast were having sex, resulting in the procreation of certain African races, black people, shocking things that he had spoken about. Talked about Ellen White plagiarizing from the writings of others and claiming that these were her own writings. Well, today, Derrick Gillespie, Seventh-day Adventist apologist, replies to these criticisms. On Religious Hard Talk, we give you all sides to the issue. We have no axe to grind. I have no dog in any religious race. I have my own opinions, which I usually keep to myself. And in this role, try to be dispassionate, except when I'm debating. Good to have you back, Derrick. Shocking statements from Mrs. White, talking about the amalgamation of man and beast as may be seen in certain races of men.
Yes. Before I get to that issue, though,
yes.
I'd like to preface my utterances here in the second appearance by recognizing that, as I've always said, what appears to be contradiction may just not be the case if you know all the facts, if you consider the background, if you consider the context. And I've always said that any text, whether it be a biblical text or a text from a book, any text that is presented without the context is simply a pretext. And so it's unfortunate that the statements by Ellen White has been misinterpreted, grossly misinterpreted, I might add, as it concerns the amalgamation statements. And I'd like to unpack what she actually wrote in a systematic way so that the audience can appreciate much better what she actually said, as opposed to what was reported that she said. I recall not just Dr. Hill, but reading various critics presenting what Ellen White said, and without any regard for the context. I have always learned that when you read the Bible or any book, if you want to understand a statement, you cannot lift it out of its page without regard for what was said before and what was said after. Therefore, leading up to that statement and what was said after. And not just that, but sometimes you need to compare what that author said using keywords in other expressions to see what was meant. And so, as I looked carefully at this amalgamation statement, I discovered a couple of things which the critics have missed. And Dr. Hill himself, with due respect for his enormous intellect and his
PhD,
exactly, 2 master's
degrees, fine
as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't matter how much you know, you can still be misguided if you're not careful.
Yes, sir.
And no attack upon him. Yes, I respect the fact that that is his journey, but my journey is different.
Okay.
And I'm going to point out quickly that when Ellen White spoke about the amalgamation of man and beast, if one is just careful to read all she said leading up to it and what she said after, you would have realized that there is nothing in the statement which indicate what the critics are saying. First of all, what I did, Ian, was I went to the statement and I took out the key controversial statements.
Yes, do.
Itemized them, and then I did a search. I actually have all of Ellen White's published writings on compact disc.
You?
every single thing she has published that has been released. I have every single thing, not in book form for everything, but on compact disc. Easily researched, easily you can do it has a search engine which takes you to every...
you have that, you have access
to that. So what I did was I looked at the key statements like, okay, in fact, what I should probably do is to read the statement first, so the audience can have an appreciation for what is controversial about it.
Yes.
But if there was one sin above another which called for the destruction of the race by the flood,
yes,
it was the base crime of amalgamation of man and beast, which defaced the image of God and caused confusion everywhere.
Sorry, an amalgamation means sex between man and beast.
No, it doesn't.
Okay, all right.
Because it's a general term, but I'll come to that.
Go on.
God purposed to destroy by a flood that powerful, long-lived race that had corrupted their ways before him. Every species of animal which God had created was preserved in the ark. The confused species which God did not create, which were the result of amalgamation, were destroyed by the flood. Since the flood, there has been amalgamation of man and beast, as may be seen in the almost endless varieties of species of animals and in certain races of men.
Certain races of men?
Good. And looking at the statement, Ian, to be honest, looking at it at face value, it does seem disconcerting and shocking.
And Uriah Smith identified with certain race African.
It is interesting that when I read for myself all that led up to the statement and what came after, and in fact when I read the excerpts from Uriah Smith's explanation,
you did that too.
I have arrived at a different conclusion, and I'm going to demonstrate why.
Okay.
Now, first of all, what I did was I took out the key points such as base crime, amalgamation, deface the image of God, and I did a check on Ellen White's expression to see how did she use these terms, because I noticed that the critics keep saying that, for instance, when she said that the amalgamation defaced the image of God, she was describing something that was unnatural. I've discovered that that's not the case. Two, they used the term base crime to suggest that it was so heinous in terms of it's again an unnatural sin.
That's right.
And of course, amalgamation, they use it to mean sexual union. And Ian, I have done the research, and here's what I've discovered.
Yes.
I did a full check of the expressions used by Ellen White that I just quoted, and here's what I have discovered. I have a little paper here I've written called Amalgamation Statements of E.G. White and the Key Expressions Involved.
Yes.
And I've learned that she used the term base crime to mean nothing more than any normal sin.
But why base? Because
exactly.
Common sense understanding of that.
I'm going to quote her use of the term base crime to suggest that it's not an unnatural sin. Because that is what the critics think it means when she uses it. And you need to find out from the author herself what did she mean.
Yes.
Don't impose a meaning without checking the background. And here's what she says. In Spiritual Gifts, Volume 3, 1864, she was writing about the sin that Joseph was tempted to commit by Potiphar's wife. And here's what she said. She described that same sin as a base crime. Not unnatural. When Joseph was tempted to deviate from the path of right, to transgress the law of God, and prove untrue to his master, he firmly resisted and gave evidence of the elevating power of the fear of God in his answer to his master's wife. After speaking of the great confidence of his master in him, by entrusting all that he had to him, he exclaims, "How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" Notice, great wickedness. He would be persuaded to deviate from the path of righteousness and trample upon God's law by any inducements or threats. Now listen carefully now how she used the term base crime. And when he was accused, and a base crime, which of course in this case would have been adultery, was falsely laid to his charge, he did not sink in despair. Now this first indicates that the term base crime used by Ellen White, based on her time in terms of the language at the time, does not necessarily mean an unnatural sin.
But it's still sex.
It is, I understand. I'm coming to that part.
All right.
But the first thing I want to refute is that it is not an unnatural sin.
Unnatural sin. Derrick Gillespie continues his argumentation for Adventism, his argumentation for the veracity of Adventism in the face of its critics. We take our first break on Religious Hard Talk. Derrick Gillespie defends Adventism against critic Dr. Andre Hill. Back to you. Derrick.
Yes, thank you again. Ian, as I was saying, so I went to do a research into the expressions as used by Ellen White under various circumstances.
Yes.
And I've discovered, first of all, that to refer to a base crime is not necessarily an unnatural sin.
Yeah, well,
Secondly,
yes.
she used the expression deface the image of God so often that it was easy for me to pick up what she actually is referring to. And she was not referring to another unnatural sin, as a matter of fact. In fact, I have a long list here of quotes, which I don't have the time.
No, we don't have the
But I'm going to quote one to show you that it can refer to simply a matter of, well, let me quote it. Child guidance, page 449. Here she's describing how parents relate to their kids and how it can deface the image of God in their children. Nothing unnatural about no sexual sin. I am filled with horror as the condition of families professing present truth is opened before me, she says. The profligacy, which means moral wretchedness, of youth and even children is almost indescribable. Parents do not know that secret vice, masturbation, is destroying and defacing the image of God in their children. Nothing unnatural here being described.
Well.
Then she goes on to describe how parents can even cause the image of God to be defaced in their children by harshness. Nothing unnatural being described. In fact, it doesn't even relate to anything sexual.
Okay, that's
yes.
Okay.
She says in the Review and Herald, January 29, 1901, we are not to place our children where they must associate with the depraved and degraded. Sometimes in His providence, God in His providence may bring our youth into association with those who are impure and intemperate.
But impure has a sexual connotation.
Not necessarily.
Well.
He will give them strength of purpose and power to resist temptation, even as He did Daniel and his associates. They must keep themselves pure, refusing to do anything that would dishonor God, living always with an eye single to His glory. They must watch for souls, laboring earnestly for those in whom the image of God has been defaced. In other words, people who are sinful and not yet having Jesus in their lives. And I could go on and on, Ian, to show you that she used the term deface the image of God in several ways.
So what was this amalgamation of man and beast?
That's the key thing I'm coming to now.
Come to that quickly.
And here's what I've discovered, Ian. She used the term amalgamation 4 times in all of her writings. As I told you, I have her 4 times. Okay. I checked all and I discovered that in terms of the released and published writings so far.
Just 4 times?
Only 4 times.
Okay. So
and therefore
it's
easy to track.
It's easy to
see the meanings.
Tell me.
And without being too long,
yes,
I have discovered that she referred to amalgamation even of people in a spiritual way. And I'm going to read this one.
No, but the amalgamation of man and beast.
I'm coming to that. And I'm saying, Ian, that the amalgamation of man and beast, I will tell you this much.
What that could mean.
When I read what she said leading up to it,
yes,
I discovered her meaning from even looking at the Bible itself. And I'm going to read leading up to the statement what she says. The descendants of Seth had separated themselves from the wicked descendants of Cain. They cherished the knowledge of God's will, while the ungodly race of Cain had no respect for God and His sacred commandments. But when men multiplied upon the earth, if you remember, this is in Genesis 6. When men multiplied upon the earth, the descendants of Seth saw that the daughters of the descendants of Cain were very beautiful. And they departed from God and displeased Him by taking wives as they chose of the adulterous race. Notice he refers to race of Cain and race of Seth, 2 separate races. The descendants of Seth were called the sons of God. The descendants of Cain, the sons of men. As the sons of God mingled with the sons of men, they became corrupt, and by intermarriage with them, lost, through the influence of their wives, their peculiar holy character, and united with the sons of Cain in their idolatry. And she went on now to describe all the degenerative sins that resulted from this union of the 2 races.
Sexual union between the 2 races, yes.
And exactly.
So
and
come
the point,
to the man and beast
exactly. Now, here's the interesting thing, Ian.
The amalgamation, it must be some sexual
Here's
thing.
what I discovered. When I read her statements after the amalgamation, she said nothing about half humans, half animals.
But man and beast.
I understand. What I'm saying now, Ian, is that the statement is just like many statements in the Bible. Difficult. Because if you do not realize that she was describing 2 things together at once, then you will mix the 2 ideas as if she's talking about the one thing. She was describing... Let me finish. Let me finish. The amalgamation would have been the line of Seth with the line of Cain.
No, man and beast, man.
I'm coming. I know, but what I'm saying is that she was describing two things together. And in describing the two things together, she gave the impression, if you read it carelessly, that it was man and beast having sex when it's impossible scientifically. And in fact, nothing
we know that.
Exactly.
But not because we know it is posterior, that it is impossible.
Yes.
We now are going to, because of our faith,
yes, well,
absolve.
Here is the thing. No, it's not absolve.
Seems...
It's understanding the context. And if you follow the context, then you would not have arrived at that unfortunate... Exactly. I'm going to give you the background.
Yes.
Genesis chapter 6.
Mean, yes.
Follow me closely.
Yes,
in Genesis chapter 6. Because this, I think, was the most shocking statement that was quoted. And therefore, we need to unpack it.
Yes.
Genesis chapter 6, if you notice how God actually arrived at his decision to destroy the world with a flood, it also demonstrates what Ellen White was talking about in terms of the gravest sin that led to God destroying the world. And here it is in Genesis chapter 6.
Yes.
Verse 1. And it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. Now some churches, unfortunately, think that angels and celestial beings had sex with. That also is not possible.
Yeah, sons of God.
Exactly. But at the same time, and when you look at the context, God only focused on humans in his anger. Never mentioned angels. That is why I know it's humans.
But not animals either.
But listen, I'm coming.
Go on.
And the Lord said, my soul shall not always strive with man. And notice, it was after the union of the two races that God get very angry and said, and Lord said, my soul shall not always strive with man, for that is flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. God therefore put a probation on man.
Yes, all right.
Notice, right after the union of two races.
Yes, two races.
Watch this now. There were giants in the earth in those days.
Yes.
And also after that, when the sons of God came unto the daughters of men, they have children to them, and the same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown. No, notice carefully, it is all of this, the punchline. Listen to it.
The beasts and the animals.
And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of his thoughts was only evil continually. And it repented the Lord that he had made man on the earth. Now notice, Ian, why is God so angry right after he describes the races of Seth and Cain uniting, daughters of men and the sons of God, to destroy the earth? It must mean that this was the significant crime that Ellen White was referring to. And she says it because she describes it leading up to the statement.
Where the peace coming? Those are two races.
I'm coming now.
Taking long to come.
And here is the interesting thing. Many people don't realize this, but I was very pleased to find that God actually prohibiting the crossing of animals in terms of creating hybrids.
Yes.
Yes, Leviticus chapter 19.
And not in the Old Testament prohibited the crossing of races marrying too.
But no.
Race not a problem.
God prohibited
for religious reasons, you want to say.
And ungodly marrying.
But races.
But remember now, if it's godly people were the Jews, you can understand why the race would be involved.
Yes.
But the point is, not many people are aware that God also not going to read it, because
even the seeds themselves must mix.
Exactly. In other words,
because it was a principle of separation.
In other words, God wanted the species
to remain pure.
Prophecy. Exactly. In terms of genetic species.
That's why races could always use the Bible, you know. And because there are some seeds there.
But the point I'm making is that I am not going to take responsibility for people who misinterpret and use it racially.
But your thing always raise some problem in the Bible.
But no.
Seeking to defend Adventism.
But the point is, Ian,
you're stirring up some
the point is,
you open a Pandora's box. But that's a separate thing.
That if the truth is in the Bible, if it makes people uncomfortable, still present it.
Yeah, I agree.
And the point I'm making here is that God in Leviticus 19 verse 19 says,
yes,
he shall keep my statutes, meaning my laws. Thou shalt not sow. Let me read that again. Thou shalt not let thy cattle gender with a diverse kind.
That's true.
When you read it in other translations, it says you must not crossbreed or create hybrids.
Yes.
Now, why would God be angry at that?
Yes.
Now, here's the interesting thing.
Yeah, but there are theological reasons for that.
In the statements Ellen White gave, she described two things. Watch me now, Ian. Animals don't normally gravitate to another species. So the only thing that would cause them to actually hybridize would be man forcing them so to do. So in other words, it is man who would actually take it upon himself to hybridize animals. You know what this implies to Ian in Leviticus 19 verse 19? It implies that the principle was learned from early.
But her statement is not...
I'm saying she's describing two things.
Using two different breeds of animal to put together, to amalgamate.
Yes.
But man and beast amalgamating, not man amalgamating.
But Ian, that is what it appears on the surface to say. But when you read the sentences leading up to it,
amalgamation of man and beast may be seen in certain races of men.
And you notice how she described races in the context of godly and ungodly. So that principle still exists today. When in fact, Ian, I could show you her statements where
Did you read the Spectrum article?
Yes.
The Spectrum is Adventist publication, albeit a liberal Adventist publication, a Spectrum, on this matter of amalgamation, where they show that Mrs. White did talk about.
Ian, what I'm trying to point out to you is that the amalgamation statement, it is unfortunate that she expressed it that way, which can cause you to misinterpret it.
And her own husband, James White, James White, endorsed what Uriah Smith said. And Uriah Smith identified certain African black people.
It was only Uriah Smith who is on record to have so misinterpreted the statement and gone on record to say it. Only Uriah Smith. And here's the interesting thing, Ian. I don't just run with what critics say, you know. I do a check for myself. And here's what I can tell you about Uriah Smith's writings and Ellen White.
For those who don't know, the uninitiated, Uriah Smith was a leading Seventh-day Adventist theologian.
But the history shows that he differed with Ellen White a number of times. In fact,
Arianism.
Here is a book that is very famous, or he's famous for. Daniel and the Revelation, 1867 version and 1897. And interestingly, in that book, he spoke a number of things that differed with Ellen White's theology in a number of ways. And yet...
But James White backed up his book.
But here's the interesting thing, Ian. And yet, the book, Daniel and the Revelation, though in it, while Ellen White was speaking about Jesus existing from all eternity, Uriah Smith was describing Jesus having a beginning.
That's true.
In that same book, while Ellen White was describing an expression in prophecy called the daily, in a different sense, Uriah Smith was describing it another way.
So what a big confusion in Adventism among the early leaders.
What it demonstrates, Ian, is that a young church, as it develops and grows, will have differences of viewpoints. And the path of the just is like a shining light. And so therefore, Ian, what you would recognize is that just the same way the disciples had differences of opinion in the early church. And Paul had to write letters to clarify things. You do find that among the early Adventists. Even Dr. Hill himself admitted when he was speaking about the fact that early Adventists were not always cognizant of pork being unclean. And he admitted that that is not problematic because a young church can grow in knowledge. What this demonstrates, Ian, is that in that young church you had differences. And I'm making the point here that though Uriah Smith might have misspoken, and he might have given a false interpretation, and the book in itself was promoted, nobody can show absolutely that that particular point that he might have been misguided on was necessarily endorsed in and of itself in just the same way.
So wasn't Mrs. White alive and around when her husband was endorsing the book and the book was going around?
But that's the point I'm making.
Why didn't she come out and say, no, you misunderstood me, I didn't mean that?
The same way she herself endorsed the book Daniel and the Revelation, which had points of difference with her. But she looked at the general picture of the endorsement
there's a difference between one endorsing a book that might disagree with one's theological ideas and endorsing a book which purports to interpret what one has said. Wouldn't you agree?
Ian,
there's a major difference between the two.
I
could endorse a book which disagrees with me. But I would not endorse a book which I know seriously misinterpreted what I had said and purports to say.
Here is a crucial thing that most of the critics are forgetting.
When
Uriah Smith wrote that book and defending Ellen White's ministry, he did not write a book about amalgamation issue. He wrote a book about her general and this was just one small issue in it.
So she could endorse the book without endorsing everything about it.
And that has been happening quite often.
Seventh-day Adventist critic, Seventh-day Adventist insider answers the critics of Adventism. We take another break on Religious Hard Talk.